She cost him his prize Stallion and 50 acres. He never regretted the trade. The morning I sold Cinder was a Tuesday. I know because Tuesdays were the days I rode the north fence, and I had to change my whole week around on account of Harlan Prooch showing up before dawn with his boy and a bank draft already written out. He'd been after that horse for 3 years. Bay roan, 16 hands, the kind of stride that makes you feel like you're riding the wind down out of a cloud. I'd bred him myself off a mare I'd had since she was a foal, and I don't mind saying there wasn't a better cutting horse in the whole of the Cimarron Basin. Harlan knew it. He knew I knew it. He came in the dark on purpose before I could change my mind. I didn't change my mind. I took the draft, helped load the horse, shook Harlan's hand, and watched him drive out through my gate with the thing I'd worked 14 years to produce. And I stood there in the cold with my hands in my pockets and felt exactly nothing, which should have told me something. When a man feels nothing selling the best thing he's ever made, something inside him has already moved on to whatever comes next. He just doesn't know it yet. What came next was a woman named Marta Horak, and 50 acres of bottom land along Cottonwood Creek that I didn't own anymore by the time winter broke, and a life I hadn't planned for and couldn't have imagined if I'd tried. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's always been my trouble. My name is Earl Denton. I was 51 years old when this happened. I'd been foreman on the Kavanaugh spread for 11 years, which means I ran 6,000 acres, a crew of 9, and every piece of Kavanaugh business that old Wade didn't feel like dealing with himself, which by that point was most of it. Wade was 73 and mostly interested in his pipe and his checker games with the circuit preacher on Wednesday afternoons. I didn't mind. I'd been running things most of my life. Running other men's things, to be precise about it. Before Kavanaugh, I'd done a stretch as a deputy sheriff up in Kansas. Before that, I'd punched cattle in 3 states. Before that, when I was young and didn't know any better, I'd ridden with a crew that wasn't strictly on the right side of the law, though nothing ever came of it that I had to answer for in court. I mention it only because a man's history shapes what he sees and what he's willing to do, and I want to be honest about what kind of man I was when this started. I was the kind of man who kept his head down and did his work. Quiet, dependable, not a man anyone thought to look at twice. I'd had one marriage young to a woman named Clara who died of fever before we'd been together 3 years. No children. I don't talk about Clara much. She was good and she deserved better than what life gave her, and I think about her still, but this isn't her story. The Kavanaugh place sat 7 miles south of a town called Redbird, New Mexico Territory, fall of 1889. Redbird wasn't much: a feed store, a land office, a saloon that doubled as the barber's on Thursday mornings, a church that was also the schoolhouse, a doctor who was also the dentist, and about 200 people who mostly minded their own business except when they didn't. The Horak claim was east of us. 40 acres of creek bottom and another 30 or so of decent grazing up on the bench above. Elsa Horak had filed on it after her husband died, not the woman I'm telling you about. Elsa was the mother-in-law, and when Elsa died 2 years after that, the claim passed to her son Pavel, who was dead of a horse accident by the time I entered the picture, leaving behind a wife named Marta, a boy named Joseph who was 14, and a girl named Ainska who was 11. There's a word in Czech, I learned it later, that means something like to make do, vystachit. Marta used it the way other people use the word fine. When you asked how she was managing, she said vystachit, and that told you more than any speech. She was making do, barely and without complaint and without any expectation that anyone was going to help. She'd been on that claim alone with her kids for 8 months when I first met her. The first time I laid eyes on her was at the feed store in Redbird, September, just as the heat was beginning to break. I was there to pick up a salt order for the Kavanaugh stock. She was there to argue with Pete Garfield about a bill. Pete ran the feed store and also served as the informal banker for anyone who didn't want to ride the 40 miles to the real bank in Colfax. He was a big man with small eyes, and he had a habit of lending money to homesteaders on terms that sounded reasonable in September and became unreasonable by March. I'd seen him do it before. I knew what I was looking at. She wasn't backing down. That's the first thing I noticed. She was maybe 5'4", dark hair pinned back with a wire hairpin that was missing one of its prongs, a dress that was clean but had been mended so many times the patches had patches. She didn't raise her voice. She had a piece of paper in her hand, and she was pointing to something on it and speaking in a voice that was steady as ground. Her English was accented, Czech. I'd find out, but every word was clear. "You wrote 12%, she said. Here, your handwriting. Pete made a sound. That's per annum, Mrs. Horak, per year, now with the compounding. I know what per annum means, she hadn't moved, and I know what compound means. And I know that what you are telling me now is not what you wrote in September. I stood there with my hat in my hand and watched Pete Garfield look at the ceiling and then look at the floor and then look everywhere, but at that piece of paper she was holding. I knew what would happen next. He'd soften the numbers just enough to keep her on the hook, and she'd leave thinking she'd won something. It was a thing I'd watched men like Pete do my whole life. I should have walked out. It was none of my business. I walked to the counter instead. Pete, I said. He looked at me. He knew who I was. Everybody in the county knew Wade Kavanaugh's foreman, if only because of what the Kavanaugh name could do to your livelihood if you crossed it. Earl, he said. The lady's reading your numbers right, I said. You want to check again, or you want me to get the circuit judge over from Colfax to check with you? There was a long silence. The feed store smelled like grain dust and axle grease. Marta Horak had gone very still. She was looking at me the way a person looks at something they can't quite identify. Pete recalculated. The number came out to what she'd said it was. She paid what she owed and no more, folded the receipt into her coat pocket, and walked out without a word. I picked up my salt order. I was almost to the door when she stopped me on the boardwalk. You did not need to do that, she said. No, but you did. Pete needed reminding. She studied me for a moment. Her eyes were dark gray, the color of river rock after rain. There was nothing soft in them and nothing frightened either, just a woman measuring a thing. I am Marta Horak, she said. The Horak claim east of the Kavanaugh land. I know, I said. I'm Earl Denton. I run the Kavanaugh spread for Wade. I know, she said. And that was the end of it. She went to her wagon and I went to mine, and I drove back to the Kavanaugh place and thought about her eyes for about 3 minutes, and then put her out of my mind, because she was a homesteader with a bad loan and 2 half-grown kids, and the kind of trouble that tends to multiply, and I had enough going on without adding to my plate. I managed to keep her out of my mind for almost 3 weeks. The trouble came in the form of 2 men named Deacon Spires and Roy Letts, who worked for a rancher called Amos Burl. Burl ran cattle on the mesa east of Redbird and had been trying to push his boundary lines south toward Cottonwood Creek for 2 years. The Horak land sat directly in the way of where he wanted to expand. Pavel Horak had held Burl off while he was alive, partly because Pavel was a big, quiet man who didn't scare easy, and partly because there were enough witnesses around that Burl couldn't be too obvious about his methods. With Pavel dead and Marta on her own with 2 kids, the calculations had changed. Spires and Letts didn't do anything you could take to the law. They just made things harder, a fence line that got cut, a water gate that came open in the night. Cattle driven across the creek bottom and through a winter garden that Marta and Joseph had put up. Small things, each one deniable, each one adding up. I heard about it from Del Marsh, who ran the livery in Redbird and had ears for everything. He mentioned it casual, like a piece of weather. I listened and said nothing. But I rode past the Horak claim that evening on my way back from checking the east pasture, which I didn't technically need to do, but the east pasture was close to the Horak boundary, and I'd been thinking about her fence line for a week in the back of my mind. Not consciously. The way a man thinks about something without admitting he's thinking about it. The fence had been cut in 3 places. The wire was lying in the grass, ends curled back neat, which meant someone with wire cutters had taken their time with it. It wasn't animals, and it wasn't accident. I sat on my horse and looked at it for a while. The sun was going down behind the mesa, turning the sky the color of an old bruise. Cottonwood Creek made its sound in the trees below, nobody around. I got down. I didn't have pliers in my saddlebag, but I had enough wire and I could do a rough splice that would hold until someone came with proper tools. I worked until it was nearly dark and I could feel the cold starting to come down off the mesa. Got back on my horse. Rode home. I didn't tell anyone about it, not Wade, not any of my crew. I just added the Horak fence to the list of things I checked on my east ride. A week later I came past and Marta was there, repairing another cut, and she looked up and saw me and didn't say anything for a moment. Joseph was working the other end of the wire with a pair of pliers, jaw set, the serious face of a boy trying to do man's work and mostly managing. This is the fourth time, Marta said. She wasn't complaining. She was informing me of a fact. I know, I said, the Burl outfit. I have no proof. No, but Burl's been wanting this creek bottom for 2 years. She kept working the wire. Her hands were bare and it was 40 degrees. I got off my horse. I have pliers, I said. I can see that you do. I worked alongside her until the fence was solid. Joseph watched me with that careful look teenage boys give strange men who show up around their mothers, not hostile exactly, just measuring. I could respect it. It was the right response. When we were done, Marta stood back and looked at the line. He will cut it again, she said. Likely. Then why fix it? Because it's your fence, I said. She looked at me, that Greyrock look. Then she said, will you come in? I have coffee. The house was small. A single main room with a curtain across the back where the kids slept. A cast iron stove, a rough table, 4 chairs, a shelf of books that surprised me, German and Czech titles, and 1 English Bible, and a copy of something by a man named Tolstoy. A lamp on the table. Clean. Bare and clean, the way places look when people have almost nothing and take care of it. The coffee was strong, and she made it in a battered enamel pot that had been mended with wire around the handle. Ainska, the daughter, watched me from behind her mother's chair with enormous eyes. Joseph sat at the table and ate a piece of bread and watched me with the measuring look. Why did you help me at Pete Garfield's store? Marta asked. She sat across from me, both hands around her cup. He was cheating you. People get cheated every day. I know. So why? I thought about it. Because you weren't going to back down, I said. And he was going to find a way around you anyway. Seemed like a shame to let him. She considered this. That is an odd reason. Maybe. There was a silence, not uncomfortable. The stove ticked. Ainska had drifted closer and was now almost at my elbow, and I held still the way you hold still around small animals so you don't startle them. Your father was a brave man, I told her. He fell off a horse, Joseph said from across the table. Joseph, Marta said. It's true, a horse rolled on him. He didn't fall off on purpose. I know it wasn't on purpose, I said. Horses are dangerous animals. Your father worked the land and he raised you and he died doing work. That's not nothing. Joseph looked at me. Something shifted in his face, not much, just a small shift. I drank the coffee, I thanked her. I rode home in the dark. October, November, I checked the fence every few days. Cut it twice more, repaired it both times, once with Marta and once alone. I told Wade about the Burl situation in a general way, enough that he'd know if it came to something serious, but I didn't make more of it than the facts warranted. Wade listened and said Burl had always been a land-hungry man, and he supposed it would come to a head eventually. I said, yes, sir, I supposed it would. The thing I noticed those weeks was this. Marta never asked for anything, not once. When I showed up at the fence, she didn't say thank God, or what took you so long, or please help me. She just made room for me to work, and then we worked together, and then she made coffee if I'd be there long enough to drink it. When I offered things, an extra spool of wire, a bag of oats I'd had extra from a delivery, she'd look at it and calculate a moment, and if it was something she genuinely needed, she'd say thank you and take it, and if it wasn't, she'd say no thank you without any fuss. She didn't want charity. She was willing to accept what was useful and nothing more. I'd known men who were the same way, not many. There's a particular kind of pride that isn't about ego, isn't about not wanting to be seen struggling. It's about knowing what you're owed and what you're not, and not reaching past your due. Marta had that. It made me careful about what I offered, and thinking about what to offer made me think about her more than I should have. I noticed other things, too. The way she laughed, which was sudden and real, when Joseph said something unexpected at the supper table one evening when I'd stayed late helping repair the creek gate. The way she ran her finger down the page when she read, slowly, like she was making sure every word counted. The particular way she set her jaw when she'd made up her mind about something, which I came to recognize from 30 yards away. The way she let Ainska braid her hair in the evenings even though it came out crooked, and she always had to redo it in the morning, because Ainska loved doing it. I noticed I was cataloging these things. That seemed like information. I was not a man who moved fast toward anything that mattered. I'd learned that much in 51 years. And whatever was building in me toward Marta Horak, I wasn't going to rush it or name it or do a single thing about it until I had to. She was a woman with enough to deal with. The last thing she needed was a worn-out ranch foreman reading his own feelings into the situation and creating trouble she hadn't asked for. So I kept showing up at the fence. I fixed what needed fixing. I drank the coffee. I held still. The hard part started in November. Amos Burl had apparently decided that slow erosion wasn't working fast enough, because Spires and Letts went from cutting fences to driving 50 head of cattle through the south corner of the Horak claim on a Wednesday night, tearing up about 6 acres of winter rye that Marta had planted in September and was counting on to feed the stock through February. They came through in the dark, moved fast, were gone before dawn. The damage was thorough. Marta found it Thursday morning, and I found Marta standing at the edge of it when I came past on my east ride. She was just standing there, very still, looking at what was left of the rye. Joseph was beside her. Ainska had stayed back at the house. I got off my horse. I stood beside her and looked at it too. There wasn't anything to say about it, so I didn't say anything. After a while she said, "That was the difference between making it to spring and not making it to spring." "I know. I have $40 left." I did the math in my head. It was bad math. "How much grain do you have laid in?" I asked. "Enough for 6 weeks, maybe 8 if I'm careful." "How many head?" 2 horses, a milk cow, 4 sheep, and some chickens. The chickens didn't much matter for winter feed. The horses and the cow and the sheep did. I thought about what the Kavanaugh stores looked like. I knew exactly what they looked like because I'd inventoried them 2 weeks prior. "I can bring you a half-ton of oats on Friday," I said, "and some hay from the south barn. We've got more than we'll need." She turned and looked at me. "What Wade doesn't know won't trouble him," I said, "and if it does, I'll sort it out." "Zerl." "What?" "You cannot keep doing this." "I'm not keeping doing anything. I fixed some fence and I'm offering some grain. It's not." "It is." She turned back to the ruined rye field. "It is more than nothing." I stood there. The wind came off the mesa with some teeth in it, and I put my hat down against it and waited. "I don't know what you want," she said, not accusatory, just plain. "I don't want anything," I said. She didn't answer that. "I mean it," I said. "I know you do," she said. "That's what makes it strange." I brought the oats and the hay on Friday. Joseph helped me unload it, and he was strong for his age, real work in his hands, and he didn't talk much, but when he did it was to the point. I showed him how to pack the hay into the shelter to keep it dry, the way I'd been shown when I was about his age by a man whose name I don't remember but whose method I've used every winter since. "You've done this a long time," Joseph said. 40 years, more or less. He thought about that. "I will do it 40 more years," he said, with the particular certainty of a 14-year-old who hasn't met all the things that can knock certainty out of you. But I liked him for it. "Your mother going to fight Burl on this?" I asked. "She's already writing a letter to the land office," Joseph said. "She wrote it 3 times because she wants the English exactly right. She'll get it right. She usually does." Saturday morning I rode to Redbird and had a conversation with the sheriff, a man named Cole Revis who was conscientious and a little cautious but not corrupt. I laid out what I knew about the Burl crew and what had happened to the Horak rye field. Revis listened and made notes and said he'd ride out to the Burl ranch and ask some questions. I said I'd appreciate it. He said he'd do it for anyone, not just on account of Kavanaugh. I said I knew that, which I did. On my way out of town, I stopped at the feed store. Pete Garfield was there. I asked him, as a point of information, whether Amos Burl had any notes outstanding with him. Pete looked like he was going to say that was private business, and I looked at him until he decided it wasn't. Burl had 1 note, not large, due in the spring, nothing significant. What I did next, I've thought about whether it was the right thing or not, and I've always come back to yes. I rode out to the Burl ranch. Burl was home. He was a tall man, lean and leathery, about 60 years old, with the look of someone who'd gotten everything he had by pushing and didn't see any reason to stop pushing. We sat in his parlor and his wife brought coffee that neither of us touched. "You've got a crew member or 2 making trouble for the Horak widow," I said. He spread his hands. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." He looked at me for a long moment. I'd had harder men look at me for longer. I didn't much care for the exercise, but I was good at it. The creek bottom's wasted on her, he said. She can't work it. She's working it fine. She's a woman alone with 2 kids. She'll be broke by February and selling the claim by March. If not to me, then to somebody else. She might surprise you, I said. I'm just being practical, Earl. No offense meant. If Kavanaugh wanted that land. We don't want that land, I said. Wade's got no interest in Cottonwood Creek. Then what's your stake in it? Good question. I thought about Marta standing at the edge of the ruined rye field. The way she stood. The way she'd said it was more than nothing. Consider it a courtesy, I said, between neighbors. This stops now, or I'm going to make it uncomfortable for your operation in ways you won't enjoy. I've been in this county 11 years, and I know where every body's buried, figuratively speaking. I would prefer not to start digging. Burl looked at me. I'm not threatening you, I said. I'm describing what will happen if things don't change. Those are different. He was quiet for a while. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, one of his horses was moving in the corral. The widow causes me no problems, he said at last, and I'll cause her none. That's all I'm asking. I rode back to the Kavanaugh place. I didn't tell Marta about it. I didn't tell anyone. It was just a thing I'd done, and it was done. December came in cold. The kind of cold that settles into the ground and doesn't lift until March. There's a particular quality to winter on the New Mexico plateau. The air is dry and sharp, and the sky goes a shade of blue that doesn't look real, too clean, like someone washed it while you weren't watching. You can see for 50 miles on a clear day, and the mountains look close enough to touch, but they're not. Marta's letter to the land office had produced a response, not a satisfying one. The land office wrote back that they were looking into the matter of the fence damage and the trespassing cattle and would be in touch in due course. Bureaucratic language for nothing would happen soon. She read me the letter by the lamp one evening in December, sitting at the table with Ainska asleep behind the curtain and Joseph doing something with a bridle near the door. And her voice was flat, and even reading it, no anger in it, just someone taking in information. What does in due course mean? She said when she'd finished. Means they're not in a hurry. I did not think they would be. She folded the letter with great precision, crease exactly on crease. So, I will write again in January. That's probably the thing to do. What else would I do? I didn't answer that. Give up, she said, answering herself. That is what else, and I am not going to give up. No, I said, I didn't think you would. Because I have nowhere to go, she said, matter of fact. This is not courage. I have no family here, no money to leave, nowhere to be except on this claim, so I stay. Staying takes whatever you want to call it, I said. She looked at me then, the gray rock look, and for a moment something moved behind it that I couldn't quite name. Not sadness exactly, more like someone looking at something that has surprised them. Then she looked down at the letter. Earl, she said. What? Are you going to come and fix my fence forever? I sat there. Joseph had stopped working the bridle. The lamp threw a circle of yellow light on the table, and everything outside it was shadow. I don't know, I said. That is an honest answer. I try to be. She set the letter aside and picked up her coffee. You are a strange man, she said. But not bad. Thank you, I said. She made a sound, not quite a laugh but close, and that was all. I don't know exactly when I knew that I would sell 50 acres to make it possible. I know I didn't decide it all at once. It came to me the way most important things come to me, piecemeal, over weeks, until one morning I woke up, and it was already a settled fact in my mind, and all that remained was to do it. The land in question was a parcel I'd bought myself, not Kavanaugh land, my own 49 acres on the south side of the creek that I'd acquired 6 years earlier as a kind of hedge. A man getting older and thinking about what he'd have when he couldn't run someone else's ranch anymore. Good land. Creek frontage, a stand of cottonwoods, decent soil. My retirement, more or less. I won't walk through all the thinking. It's enough to say I thought about it a long time, and the conclusion was always the same. If I sold that land, Marta Horak could survive the winter and make it to spring with her claim intact, enough buffer between her and whatever Burl or the world sent next that she had a real chance. Without it, the odds were not good. I'd done the math enough times to know. I also knew, and this part I was careful about, careful and honest with myself, I knew that it wasn't entirely about mathematics. I was aware of that. I was 51 years old and I'd spent 30 years doing the right thing without much return on it, and I wasn't going to dress this up in pure virtue. I cared what happened to Marta Horak. I cared what happened to Joseph and Ainska. That caring was real, and it had some warmth in it that was personal, and I wasn't going to lie to myself about it. But I was also clear, I was very clear, that what she needed from me had nothing to do with what I might want, and those two things were entirely separate. And if she never felt anything more for me than gratitude for a neighbor's help, that was a fine outcome and I'd live with it. I wasn't doing this to purchase anything. I'm saying this because I need you to understand what kind of man I was trying to be. Not a saint, just a man trying to be straight about his motives. I sold Cinder on a Tuesday. By Thursday, I'd deposited enough in the bank to cover 2 months of whatever Marta needed for supplies, fuel, and feed. I set it up as an anonymous line of credit through Pete Garfield, who owed me a favor now, whether he liked it or not, worded as a community agricultural loan with interest at 2%, which was as close to nothing as I could get away with without Marta seeing through it immediately, which she might anyway. She was smart about money. The 50 acres I sold to a family from Missouri who'd come through in the fall, decent people, the kind who'd take care of land. It went in January for a price that was fair, but not what it would have been in better years. I didn't wince at the number. I signed the papers and walked out of the land office and stood in the cold redbird air for a minute and felt not nothing this time, something quiet and solid. Like a man who's just done what he came to do. She found out in February. I should have known she would. Pete Garfield apparently couldn't help himself and let something slip when she went in to draw on the credit, some comment about arrangements having been made. And Marta was the kind of woman who pulled on a thread when she found one. She came to the Kavanaugh place on a Saturday afternoon in a wagon, which told me she wasn't just passing by, and I saw her coming up the road from the south pasture where I was working a green horse on a lunge line. I put the horse up and met her in the yard. She sat in the wagon seat for a moment before she got down. When she got down, she had that set to her jaw that I knew meant she'd already decided what she was going to say, and was just organizing the order. "You sold land," she said. "Some. For me." "Not exactly." "Exactly," she said. "Pete told me about the loan. He didn't mean to, but he told me." She was looking at me very straight. "Earl, you sold your land." "I had too much," I said. "Do not do that. Don't make a small thing of it." I looked at the ground. "All right." "You sold your land," she said again, quieter. "And your horse, I think. Pete said something about Cinder, and I remember you talking about that horse, the bay roan." I hadn't mentioned Cinder to her. I was mildly impressed that she'd tracked it down. "He was a good horse," I said. "Earl," her voice had changed. Something had come into it that wasn't the steady, flat tone I was used to. "Why?" "Because I could," I said. "That is not a reason. It's the only one I've got." We stood there in the Kavanaugh yard in February cold, wind coming off the mesa, her looking at me and me looking at the barn door because I didn't quite know how to meet those Greyrock eyes right then. "You should have asked me," she said. "You would have said no." "Yes, I would have." A pause, "Which is why you didn't ask." "More or less." Another pause, longer. "I don't know how to repay this," she said. "I'm not asking to be repaid." "I know you're not. That is," she stopped. "That is the hardest part." Her voice was careful, like she was walking on ice and testing her weight. "All my life I have dealt with people who want something. Always. Even good people, even people who meant well, there is a want underneath. You give me help and you want nothing. And that," she stopped again. I waited. "It makes me feel," she put her hand over her breastbone, a small pressing motion. "I don't have the word in English." "Take your time," I said. She thought for a moment. "Protected," she said. Not that I cannot protect myself. I know I can, but like there is someone else holding the other end of the rope. You understand?" "I understand," I said. I looked at her then. She was looking at me with something in her face that I'd been careful not to look for too hard all these weeks, and now I couldn't look away from it. It wasn't soft. It wasn't grateful exactly. It was direct, like she was looking at me the way she looked at the piece of paper in Pete Garfield's store, plainly, seeing what was actually there. "Earl Denton," she said. "What?" "You are a very good man." I didn't know what to say to that. I'd been called a lot of things, some of them deserved and some not, and no one had ever said it quite that way and looked at me quite that way when they said it. I've had my moments, I said. The corner of her mouth moved. Yes, she said, you have. There was one night in December I haven't mentioned yet. A hard freeze, the kind that comes fast and without warning, temperature dropping 30 degrees in 6 hours. I was up at 2 in the morning checking the Kavanaugh stock tanks when I thought about the Horak place, and their hand pump by the barn, which was an old one, cast iron, and would freeze through if the pipe wasn't wrapped right. I told myself it was none of my business. I told myself that twice more, and then I saddled a horse and rode east. The house was dark except for a faint light at the window, which meant she was still up or had woken for something. I didn't want to knock at 2 in the morning and startle her, so I went to the barn first and found the pump, which had already started to freeze. The handle was stiff, and the overflow was crusted with a thin glaze. I found her rags and wrapping material on the shelf above the pump, the good materials a person puts ready when they're thinking ahead, and I got to work. She appeared in the barn doorway 10 minutes later with a lantern and a coat over her nightclothes and her hair loose, which I'd never seen before. She looked at me and looked at the pump, and for a moment didn't say anything. How did you know? She said. I didn't, I thought about it. She came over and held the lantern while I worked. Her hair in the lamplight was dark and long, reaching to her shoulder blades, and I made a deliberate effort not to look at it and looked at the pump instead. It would have frozen through, she said. By morning. Maybe before. Joseph and I would have fixed it. I know you would have. She said nothing for a while. Her breath made small clouds in the cold. The milk cow, she said. I came out to check her an hour ago. She's restless. Cold coming through the boards on the north side, I said. I can see the gaps from here. You got any canvas? In the corner there. Pavel bought it for a wagon cover. I finished with the pump and we went to the north wall with the canvas and tacked it in 3 places while she held the lantern and the cow moved in her stall and Marta spoke to her in Czech, low, continuous, the way you'd talk to a child. Not baby talk. Real words, a calm, steady explanation of the situation, as though the cow was a person who'd been worried and deserved an honest account of what was being done about it. I mentioned this. She understands tone if not words, Marta said. Same as most people. I thought about that. You're probably right, I said. The cow settled. We stood for a moment in the fixed-up barn, lantern light, cold held back by the canvas on the north wall. It was past 3. The freeze had fully set, and outside everything was silent, the kind of silence that only happens when it's very cold and the whole world is holding itself together against it. Come inside, Marta said. I'll make tea. I sat at the kitchen table while she put the kettle on, her back to me, and the house was just as she left it. Joseph's bridal work on the side table, a book lying open, Ainska's shoes by the door where she'd stepped out of them. The lamp was low and she didn't raise it. When she sat down, she'd pushed her hair back and pinned it loosely. She had a certain self-possession about her at 3 in the morning in her own kitchen, not the careful self-possession of the daylight hours, the managed steadiness, but something more natural. The ease of someone who is simply who they are without having organized themselves for company. The tea was something I didn't recognize, a dried plant slightly bitter. What is this? I asked. Linden, my mother sent it from home. For sleep, she looked at her cup, though I am not sure sleep is coming tonight. The freeze will pass by Friday. I know, she turned her cup slowly. Earl, do you have someone, family? It was the first time she'd asked anything personal that direct. I thought about it. No one close, I said. Parents gone, no brothers or sisters that lived. My wife died 20-some years ago. Her name? Clara. She said it back, the way she said things she wanted to commit to hearing it, not just repeating it. Was it long, the sickness? Fast, I said. 6 days between healthy and gone. That is its own cruelty, she said. Pavel was 3 weeks, which sounds longer and is, but at least I could, she stopped. I could be there. I could tell him things. Yes. Did you tell Clara things? I thought about it. Some, not all of it. I was young and I thought there would be more time. Yes, she nodded slowly, not agreeing with me, agreeing with the shape of the thing, the recognition of it. I told Pavel everything I could think of. I sat with him and I talked for 3 weeks, and by the end I had run through all of it, every memory, every complaint, everything I was grateful for. She looked at the table. And then he was gone, and I thought, all right, I have said it all, now I go on. The stove ticked. Outside, a branch, a fence board, cracked in the cold. That took something, I said. Yes, she said, it took almost everything. She looked up at me then, level, but not quite everything. That is the point, not quite. I looked at her across the table in the low lamplight, and I thought, this is who she is. Not the woman who fixed the fence, not the woman who argued Pete Garfield to a standstill. This, a woman who sat with a dying husband for 3 weeks and spoke every true thing she had to say and then stood up from it and went on. That's who I was dealing with. I wanted to be sure I understood it. You're going to be all right, I said. I know, she said. I said that, didn't I? Vistachit. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Making do. More than that, I said. She looked at me for a moment. Maybe, she said. We'll see. I finished the tea. I thanked her and went back out into the freeze and rode home in the dark, and I thought about what she'd said the whole 7 miles. Not quite everything. That is the point. I knew what she meant. I'd felt the same thing after Clara, that particular surprise, that grief takes nearly everything and nearly is not all. There is something that persists, something that doesn't go away no matter how hard you try to let it all go. I'd spent 20 years thinking that persistence was just stubbornness, a failure to let go right. That December night on the ride home, I thought maybe it was something else. Maybe it was the part that knows what it needs next, even when you don't. March, April, the claim survived the winter. The winter rye was lost, but the credit line covered what it needed to cover. And when the letter from the land office finally came in March, nearly 4 months after Marta's second letter, and clearly prompted by some follow-up from Sheriff Rivas, who'd done his job quietly and well, it informed her that the matter of the Burl trespass had been reviewed and found substantiated, and that appropriate notices had been sent to the Burl operation regarding their responsibilities under territorial grazing law. Not much, but a line in the record. It counted. Burl did nothing more. I don't know if it was because of the land office letter or our conversation or both. It didn't matter. The Horek claim sat there along Cottonwood Creek, and the spring came up around it, and the rye came back, and the creek ran clear and cold, and the cottonwoods put out their first green. I kept riding the east fence. Not as often, the immediate need had settled, but I kept riding it. One afternoon in April, Marta came out to meet me before I reached the fence line. She came across the south pasture on foot, which meant she'd seen me coming and had walked out to intercept me, which she'd never done before. I pulled up and got down from the horse. She'd made a thing. A cake, I found out when she handed me the cloth it was wrapped in, a Czech cake. She said not the American kind, made with something that tasted like plum and a little cardamom, from a recipe that had been her grandmother's. She'd made it in the shape of a braid. I stood there in the April sun holding this braided cake in a clean cloth, and for a moment I didn't quite know what I was supposed to do with it. You didn't have to do this, I said. I know, she said. I wanted to, there is a difference. I looked at the cake, I looked at her. Thank you, I said. It's not payment, she said. I know. It's just I wanted to make you something, with my hands, something I made myself because that is what I have. She looked at the cake in my hands for a moment. I made it twice. The first one was wrong. I looked at the braid. It was good work, even and close. Your grandmother's recipe, I said. Yes, she taught me when I was 8. I haven't made it since Pavel died. Something about that. The weight of it, I stood there and felt it. What was your grandmother like? I said. Marta smiled. It was a real smile, the whole face, the kind that reaches all the way in. She was terrible, she said. She was the strictest woman I ever knew. She didn't say kind things. She showed up. Every time something was needed, she was there. She never explained herself. She looked at me. I looked at her. You would have liked each other, she said. Maybe, I said. No, she said. You would have. She reached out and adjusted the cloth folded over the cake, a small adjustment, unnecessary, just something to do with her hands. She died before Pavel and I came to America. I think about her when I don't know what to do. I ask, what would she do? And then I do that. And what would she have done this winter? The same things I did, Marta said. She would have fixed the fence. She would have written the letters. She would have kept going. She paused. She also would have accepted help from a good man without making it complicated. We stood there. The April wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek and made a sound like something turning over. Her horse was in the near pasture, drifting toward the water. My horse stood patient beside me. "I have been thinking," Marta said. "About what?" "About many things." She looked across the creek. "About what it is to rebuild a life, about how a person knows when they trust someone." I waited. "I trust you," she said, simply. "I'm glad," I said. "I want you to know that it wasn't because of the land or the grain or the loan." She was looking at me directly again, that clear gray rock look. "I trusted you before any of that, from the feed store. There was something in the way you spoke to Pete Garfield. You didn't do it for show. You just did it because it was right." "Pete needed reminding," I said. "Yes," she said. "You said that before. I think that is exactly who you are. You see what needs doing and you do it without a speech, without wanting credit. I don't know many men like that." I didn't know what to say. I'd lived 51 years inside my own skin, and no one had ever described me so exactly to my face before. It was an odd feeling, not uncomfortable. Just a man hearing himself named right for the first time. She put her hand over mine where I was holding the cloth-wrapped cake. Her hand was warm. She didn't move it right away. "Come for supper Sunday," she said. "Joseph has been asking about you. He wants to know about horses." "I'll come," I said. "Good," she stepped back. "Don't eat all the cake before then." "I make no promises," I said. She laughed that real sudden laugh and turned and walked back across the pasture toward the house, and I stood there with the cake and the horse and the April wind, and I felt something settle in me that I hadn't felt settled in a very long time. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter than happiness. Something that has more staying power. Sunday. I brought a piece of tack Joseph had asked to look at, an old cavalry bridle that had belonged to a man I'd ridden under in Kansas, good Spanish silver work on the headstall. Joseph went over it for an hour like a jeweler, asking questions that were smarter than his age. Ainska made me show her how to whistle through 2 fingers, which I'd learned at 12, and she mastered at 11 with about 15 minutes of practice and no patience for failure. Marta made a soup from something she'd been saving, with dumplings the Czech way in broth and bread she'd baked that morning. And we ate at the table with the lamp lit and the stove burning and the creak audible through the thin wall. It was not a grand occasion. There was no occasion at all, that was the thing. It was just supper. And somehow that was everything. After Joseph read, he was working through a book about the American frontier that he'd gotten from the teacher in Redbird, reading it with a pencil, making small marks, and Ainska sat at her mother's feet while Marta braided her hair, the crooked braid that would have to be redone in the morning. I sat near the stove and looked at nothing in particular and did not feel the need to talk. "Do you like it here?" Ainska asked me out of nowhere. "I do," I said. "Joseph says you'll come back." "Joseph said that?" Joseph turned a page without looking up. "I said he'd probably come back," he said. "I didn't say more than that." "That's enough," Ainska said, with the unassailable logic of an 11-year-old. Marta looked at me over Ainska's head. A plain look, no performance in it. The kind of look that is just a person seeing you and letting you know they see you. I looked back. "May, we didn't rush anything. I don't think either of us was the kind to rush. I came to supper on Sundays. Sometimes I came on a weekday when there was a practical reason, a gate to fix, a fence section that needed restringing after the spring runoff softened the posts. We talked more, talked real things, not weather and cattle, though also weather and cattle. She told me about Bohemia, where she'd grown up, the way the country looked, cold and green, the way people there said goodbye when they didn't expect to see someone again. A word I couldn't pronounce that she had to say to me 4 times before I got even close. I told her about Kansas, and the man I'd worked for at 19 who taught me everything worth knowing about cattle and nothing worth knowing about people. She told me about Pavel without making it into a monument. He was good, she said, and he was funny, funnier than she'd expected when she married him, and he worked hard and he loved the children and she missed him still. I said I understood about missing someone. She looked at me and I think she knew about Clara without asking. One evening in May, we sat on the low step outside her door and the whole mesa was lit up by the last of the light, orange red, the way it gets in May, and she leaned against my arm. Not dramatically. Just her shoulder against mine, the weight of it, and stayed there. I didn't move. After a while, I put my arm around her shoulders, just rested it there, and she didn't move either, and we sat there until the light was gone and the stars came out over the mesa, white and thick. The kind of sky you can only see when you're a long way from anywhere. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, very quiet, "I am going to be all right." "I know it," I said. "I mean, I know it now. This winter I wasn't sure, now I know." "Good," I said. "Because of me," she said, "but also because of you." She turned her head and looked at me, that close. The lamplight from inside made one side of her face warm and the other was shadow. "Both things are true." "Both things are true," I agreed. She settled back against my shoulder. The mesa was dark now. The creek made its sound. I sat there and thought, this is the thing I didn't know I was going to get. This particular evening, this particular woman, this weight against my shoulder, not the horse, not the land, this. I didn't feel like I'd lost anything. June, I had a conversation with Wade Kavanaugh that I'd been building toward for a month. I told him I was thinking of leaving the foreman's position at the end of the year. Not because anything was wrong, but because I had a direction I wanted to go, and it wasn't going to work as a half measure. Wade listened. He had his pipe. He was quiet for a while after I finished. "The Horak widow," he said. "Yes, sir." "Good land down there," he said. "Cottonwood Creek's reliable. Better than most in this county." "Yes, sir." "The kids'll need someone." "I'm awares. Boy's capable from what I hear." "He is, girl too." Wade drew on his pipe. "Earl," he said, "you've run this place better than anyone I've had, and I've had 4. I'm not going to make a big thing of it. A man's got to live his own life, or what's the point of living it?" I thanked him. "Come back and work for me if things go wrong," he said. "I don't expect things to go wrong," I said. "No," Wade said, "I don't either." I asked her on a Wednesday. I'd thought about how to do it, and I couldn't think of a ceremony that would suit either of us, so I did it while we were mending the south fence, which seemed right. Working together, something practical. She'd been holding the wire tight, and I'd been working the splice, and I just said it, not framed up with anything before or after. She was quiet for a moment, still holding the wire. Then she said, "You are sure?" "I've been sure since February," I said. "Took me until now to say it." "Why now?" "Because the fence needed mending," I said, "and you were here." She made that sound again, not quite a laugh, but close. She shook her head. "Joseph will want to have a say," she said. "I'll talk to Joseph. Ainska will want to plan things. She can plan whatever she wants." A pause. She was looking at the splice I'd just made, turned her eyes to it the way she turned her eyes to anything she was considering with serious attention. "Earl," she said. "What?" "I am not easy." "I am," she thought for a moment. "Particular, I do things my way, I will not be managed." "I've noticed," I said. "Good, then you know." She turned and looked at me. "I am asking you to know that before you say it again." "I know it," I said. "Ask me again." She did something with her mouth, pressing her lips together, a held-back expression, something between serious and amused. "Ask you what?" "If I'm sure." A pause. "Are you sure?" she said. "Yes," I said. She let the wire go. She took a step toward me and put both her hands flat against my chest. Not a push, just a placing, the same steady pressure she used for everything. And she looked at me from that distance for a moment with those gray rock eyes, and what I saw in them was something I hadn't seen since I was a very young man with Clara. And then only briefly before it was gone, the look of a woman who has decided, who has thought it through and looked at all the angles and looked at you specifically and chosen. She chose me. I want to say that plain. Because I'd spent most of my adult life being the man who ran things for other people. The man who showed up and fixed what needed fixing and asked for nothing and got close to nothing. The dependable man, the capable man. The man no one thought to look at twice. And here was this woman with her gray eyes and her grandmother's cake recipe and her crooked braidwork and her fight in her that hadn't bent in the worst winter of her life. Here was this woman putting her hands on my chest and looking at me like I was the thing she'd calculated her future around. I put my hands over hers. "Then yes," she said. "Yes," I said. We stood at the south fence in June with the creek sound and the cottonwood smell and the mesa going gold in the afternoon light. And it was not a grand moment, which is exactly what made it grand. There's not much left to tell that needs telling. We were married in September at the Redbird Church, which was also the schoolhouse, so the wedding had 30 chairs and a chalkboard that still had long division on it from the Friday lesson. Joseph stood up with me. Ainska stood with her mother. Wade Kavanaugh came and sat in the back and didn't say much and shook my hand afterward with both of his, which was more than most men would have done. I moved to the Horak claim in October. It was strange, the first weeks, not being the Kavanaugh foreman. 40 years of working other men's land, and then one morning you wake up and everything in sight belongs to you. To us. The weight of that settled differently than I expected. Not heavier, lighter, like a thing you'd been carrying a long time on the wrong side finally balanced out. Joseph and I rebuilt the barn that winter, properly this time, with timber from the mesa above squared and notched right. It took 6 weeks and we didn't talk much while we worked, but at the end of every day when we came in out of the cold, Marta had supper on and the lamp lit, and I learned what it was to come in from work to your own place. To someone who had been waiting for you. Not waiting in the passive way, she was never passive a minute in her life, but waiting in the sense that your return was the thing she'd been working toward all day, the thing that completed the shape of it. Ainska was 13 by then, and decided she was going to teach herself to read Czech so she could read her grandmother's letters, which lived in a tin box on the shelf above the books. Marta sat with her at the table every evening for 2 months, going through the letters word by word, and sometimes I'd watch them from across the room. The lamp between them, their heads bent together, the girl's finger moving along the lines, and I understood that I was looking at something I'd been given that I hadn't earned and couldn't have paid for with anything. Not with land, not with horses, not with anything I owned. I'm an old man now. I won't say how old. Old enough that a hard winter feels harder and the mesa looks different from what it did. A little more, I don't know. More there. Like it's got more weight to it now that I know what it costs to stay in its shadow. Marta's hair has gone mostly gray. She still pins it back with whatever's available and it still comes loose by midday. She still makes the braided cake for important occasions. She still reads with her finger on the page. She still has the gray rock eyes, though they've softened some, not gone soft, just the edges of the stone smooth out over time. Joseph runs most of the operations now. He grew into exactly what you could see him becoming at 14. His hands know what they're doing. He has 3 kids of his own, and his wife keeps a good house down near the creek. Ainska married a schoolteacher from Colfax and lives 4 hours east, and when she visits, she does the braided cake with her mother in the kitchen while I sit outside and listen to them argue pleasantly about the recipe, which hasn't changed in 30 years to my knowledge, but which they treat as a live question every time. I think about Cinder sometimes. The bay roan. I hope he had good years. He was a horse built to run, and I hope he got to run. I don't regret selling him. I've never once looked at this land, this house, this woman beside me and regretted any of it. People ask sometimes, the way people will, what made me do what I did back then. Help a woman I barely knew. Sell land, sell a horse. People expect there to be a better answer than the one I give, which is that she needed help and I could give it and I had the sense to see it. That seems like enough to me. It seemed like enough then. The morning I sold Cinder it was cold and I felt nothing, and I drove back from the Prout place through the early light and somewhere east of the Kavanaugh fence line, I passed a hawk sitting on a post with its back to the wind, patient, unhurried. And I didn't think about it at the time, but I think about it sometimes now, that hawk on the post. A thing can be exactly where it belongs and not know it yet. I know it now.